The best estimate by leading vaccine producers is that it could take a year or more to develop, test, and manufacture a vaccine for the clade X virus.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. You know, is the price worth it? That the price, we think the price is worth it.
Richie Brown Show.
Welcome back to the Richie Brown Show, and today I have an article for you. Johns Hopkins University, are you ready for the next pandemic? A military psychological warfare institution for global control. So the Johns Hopkins University earlier in spring, really in the spring magazine, released an article saying, are we ready for the next one? What COVID 5 years later can teach us in an age of pandemics. Are you ready for the next pandemic was the headline of a recent article by Johns Hopkins University, a headline to the lay reader that may seem completely innocuous. In this context of what Johns Hopkins University represents, a deeply entrenched state asset involved in biomedical murder, pandemic exercises, and a cutout for the Mossad. In short, your enemies are busy preparing for the next, quote, pandemic, unquote, they can use to justify a second global coup d'etat. The future of the entire world is Haiti and Gaza. In Wall Street Journal, 12th of March 2025, I noticed an article about Johns Hopkins University getting major cutbacks, in which $800 million in grants is being cut. As a result, a number of USAID, like in other words CIA, and international health projects are being cut alongside a transgender health clinic in India. And here's the article. So they terminated 800 million in cuts. USAID stopped on a number of international health projects. They cut a transgender health clinic in India. I mean, if you've been following my writings a while, you know that you know all about National Security Memorandum 200, how the United States is a parasitic rentier state that wants its monopolies for total global control. So they have to. The only way they can really maintain their monopolies is by degrowth. That's why you see so much degrowth shit in the Marxist movement. Yeah, and also another interesting thing I was reading about in this article was that Johns Hopkins confirmed the authenticity of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and looking at the corruption in the Bible translations in the last 150 years, which is why quite a lot of people are King James only fanatics before the worldwide oligarchy really got their teeth into trying to strip the Bible of its original meaning. Yeah, and contraception in Nigeria, because of National Security Memorandum 200, it outright states that growing populations will put pressure on the puppet governments of the United States. So they don't want populations to grow anywhere. It's disgusting. Shortly after this article, Johns Hopkins was asking if we were ready for the next pandemic. Johns Hopkins University is a premier psychological warfare unit to impress the entire of humanity to ensure the smooth running of US-led global capital. Linked very tightly to the permanent state in Washington, it has played a key role in deep state operations, the spread of global transgenderism, and the promotion of eugenics and population control throughout the world. The university is responsible for educating many people for US government, as well as its international organizations, so-called, quote, non-governmental organizations, unquote, financial institutions and journalism. Essentially the intelligentsia that make up the ruling class state apparatus of the United States. By the 1950s, neo-Malthusians who had the ideology of technocracy had gained control of the US government and its foreign policy, most notably Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Technocracy essentially worships efficiency and sees human beings as less than cattle, marrying very well to Malthusianism and eugenics, whilst the transhumanist movement there formed something that Nick Land has pushed called the Dark Enlightenment. Understanding that the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, cyber-physical, big data, cognitive computing, would probably have inhuman characteristics, but at the same time be as impactful as the Enlightenment. I mean, that is where I do disagree with like Nick Land and that. I think we're heading into a new dark age. I don't think we're getting any enlightenment whatsoever. Just as one example, look at what the AI chatbots are doing to the intelligence of people and their cognitive function. Some of them can't even function without ChatGPT anymore. That's when they're not falling in love with their chatbots. If technocracy has complete contempt for humanity and worships efficiency, then the Dark Enlightenment is that plus a giant dose of sociopathy. In this essay, we explore how these topics interconnect by an utterly decadent and predatory bourgeois class who hold open depopulation agendas. Johns Hopkins University has played a significant central figure in the last 50 years. Background: the world situation with the onset of the Cold War and the return of Malthusian ideology. After 1945, the United States found itself with an industrial base intact. Asia and Europe were in ruins, and the USA was the only advanced capitalist nation to retain its industrial centres it could use to rebuild Europe and tie Europe to itself via the Marshall Plan. With fascism destroyed primarily by the heroic Soviet Union and the mass sacrifice our country made, the United States appeared as the hub of international fascism. Operation Paperclip saw huge amounts of Nazis guilty of war crimes to work for the United States and shielded from justice. They were shielded from their own government. The CIA was hiding people from the own US government. Ukrainian fascists flocked to London, Toronto and USA, where they were protected by the CIA and shielded from justice. Zionist fascists found themselves a protectorate in USA, Britain, Canada and the rest of Europe. The situation was summed up neatly by George Kennan, largely responsible for starting the Cold War. Quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth and only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security." George Kennan, and he wrote the long telegram which basically started the Cold War. Previously, I've stated, quote, "The pattern of relationships pursued by the United States would be in spreading Malthusian ideology, as history disproved the Malthusians wrong with their limits to growth, as humanity continued to flourish and get better over time. The Malthusian push by the Club of Rome was a success, though. Limits to Growth went on to sell 30 million copies in more than 30 languages, making it the best-selling environmental book in history. It contributed to the Kissinger Report, otherwise known as National Security Memorandum 200, in which depopulation of other countries became a stated US national security goal. Population growth of foreign nations provides more geopolitical power and possible opposition to US interests. So these are bullet points from National Security Memorandum 200. 2. The United States relies on countries being underdeveloped in order to easily obtain natural resources. And 3. High birth rates result with more younger individuals who oppose established governments. And 4. American businesses are vulnerable to interference by foreign governments that are required to provide for growing populations. And that's from my article, Fascism Comes in Green as Well as Brown. By 1974, the National Security Memorandum 200 made depopulation a US national security goal, though these Malthusian ideas had been swirling in the permanent state in USA for longer than that, as we shall see. For those who find it hard to read between the lines, it should become quite clear how evil, depraved, decadent and devoid of humanity our cosmopolitan bourgeoisie or capitalist imperialist class has become. But it explains succinctly why the world is descending into rank barbarism. As capitalism is an economic system that is well past its sell-by date, it has turned into a horrific imperialist system of rent collection and destruction of productive forces. It retards technical development in industry, whilst leaving a whole swath of humanity on the scrap heap of unemployment at best and destroyed at worst. And this is murdered through wars, abortions, euthanasia programs. I mean, that's really jumped up. When I did my Scientific Killers article a couple of years ago, commenting on the phenomena of euthanasia in Canada, I didn't think it would ramp up this quickly to the UK. I thought it would take years for it to come to the UK. Unable to cope with an ever-expanding overproduction crisis, it has moved most of the economy out of the industrial sector, the production of real, tangible things, to completely parasitic financial sector, finance, real estate, insurance, crypto coin pump and dumps, etc. Its real economic basis has demanded the destruction of human beings who represent productive forces that could be set to the task of transforming nature and building real things. Just as the societies based on slavery were unable to cope once the expansion of their empires declined, capitalism cannot cope with the modern problems of economy except through destroying human beings. In the exact same way that the USA will raise a city, then hand out construction contracts to its American monopolies to rebuild it, giving capital a new lease of life on the rubble, dead bodies, and spent US weaponry for arms manufacturers. Pandemic exercises and global health. The lockdowns we experienced during the COVID event were done in a meticulous worldwide fashion. They were not by accident, but had been prepared in advance. Johns Hopkins University played a central role in these exercises that foreshadowed actual events. The reason for what has now become known as COVID-19 is the stark truth that vaccines can produce as enough money as most modern wars. And this is a quote from Torsten Engelbrecht's Virus Mania. Alleged pandemics are even more lucrative today than wars. The impact of real beneficiaries of the pandemic panic mongering, the pharmaceutical companies on the world's leading US health authorities, is grave. The manufacturers of antiviral drugs, vaccines, and laboratory tests can expect additional global sales of tens of billions of euros. So the benefiting major shareholders can live quite well with a little pseudoscience and panic mongering, and without a conscience. That is a very good book. I recommend you read it. Some writers who write on the COVID-19 events see things in terms of pure conspiracy theory, and frankly, not in class terms. Ever since human beings have created economic systems in which a surplus can be hoarded, a rapacious class has sought to claw its way to the top of society so that wealth can be hoarded in ever greater numbers into a black hole that can never be satisfied. Whether those social economic systems have been called slavery, feudalism, or capitalism, only under socialism as seen in the Soviet Union from 1932 to 1956 and modern DPRK has the modern exploitation of man by man been done away with to be a society that is run by the masses who own their productive forces. The COVID-19 event was most of all an event of class warfare in which the capitalist class chose to wage war on the vast majority of humanity and mass murdered them in incalculable numbers, partly because of the revolting culture and decadence of the capitalist class and its praising of Malthusian ideology, and partly because of the economic incentive to destroy productive forces. And human beings represent the living embodiment of productive forces for the continued maintenance of capitalism. Dark Winter 2001. Dark Winter was an exercise that ran from 22nd of June to 23rd of June 2001 of a bioterrorist-induced national security crisis hosted at Johns Hopkins University, where terrorists started a small outbreak in the United States. The simulation was a collaborative effort led by the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies, part of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in collaboration with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Analytic Services, Institute for Homeland Security, and the Oklahoma National Memorial Institute for the Prevention of Terrorism. The concept design and script of the simulation was created by Tara O'Toole and Thomas Inglesby of the Johns Hopkins Center, along with Randy Larson and Mark Demeyer of ANSWER. The full script of the exercise can be read here. Whitney Webb, All Roads Lead to Dark Winter. She was on that in April 2020, so she's got her money on the pulse. The name Dark Winter took its name from Robert Cadleck during the exercise, declaring, "The problem is we do not have enough vaccines. It's going to be a very dark winter," Robert Cadleck. Only 3 months later would the 2001 anthrax attacks happen, coinciding with 9/11. The key participants of Dark Winter would become participants in Event 201 and Crimson Contagion and the COVID-19 event itself. Quote, "The leaders of two controversial pandemic simulations that took place just months before the corona crisis, Event 201 and Crimson Contagion, share a common history. The 2001 biowarfare simulation Dark Winter. Dark Winter not only predicted the 2001 anthrax attacks, but some of its participants had clear foreknowledge of these attacks. The pandemic exercise was complete with realistic news reports to get participants in the mood. The below video details people trying to escape the smallpox outbreak and descending into firefights because of it."
We have a breaking story from Oklahoma. We go straight to Andy Fields of Oklahoma City's KMSA. Andy, are you there?
Angie, Texas Governor Rick Parsons has now suspended all surface and air contact between Texas and Oklahoma. He has ordered his state troopers and the National Guard to seal the borders. Now, we're about a mile away from the Texas border here, just near Interstate 35 and the Red River Bridge that connects the two states. The troopers here have taken the media to what they call a so-called safe spot. But as we've told you earlier today, Oklahomans by the carload have been seen leaving the state in every direction trying to escape this deadly smallpox outbreak. Now, we have reports of vigilantes at the Texas border trying to stop people from coming over. I don't know if you just heard that. There was a shot fired. We've heard there's another one. Now, we're not sure where these shots are coming from. We're a little too far away from the border to hear this here, but but there have been shots. This is the second time in the hour we've heard this. The National Guard and the Oklahoma State Troopers are here with us. We're not certain who's doing the firing or if what we're hearing is return firing. There's another shot. It's starting to sound like a war zone. I'm Andy Field reporting.
Yes, that's the kind of news reports that were coming out. And this is on day 12 of the outbreak. People began demonstration for more vaccines, as described in the mock news report below.
No other country in the world is accepting flights originating in or transiting the U.S. On day 12 of the worst public health crisis in America's history, demonstrations for more vaccine in hard-hit communities disintegrated into riots and looting around the nation. Interstate commerce has stopped in several regions of the nation. A national suspension of trading on America's stock exchanges takes effect tomorrow. International commerce with the U.S. has virtually ceased. The Centers for Disease Control report that efforts to stem the smallpox epidemic have depleted America's inventory of smallpox vaccine. While the CDC may be out of the vaccine, at least 45 internet websites are now offering what they claim are safe, effective vaccines. These claims have not.
See that slogan?
We repeat, they have not been independently verified. Authorities urge caution. At least 25 states and 10 foreign countries are reporting smallpox infections. At the United Nations temporarily meeting in Geneva, China has sponsored a resolution to censure the U.S., blaming America for reintroducing smallpox to the world. It demands the U.S. supply the world with vaccine. Since the diagnosis of 20 smallpox cases in Oklahoma City 12 days ago, hundreds have now died, thousands have become infected. The latest figures show more than 15,000 new cases in the past week. Officials now question whether a single attack could be responsible for this outbreak pattern developing in the U.S. But they project that each 2 to 3 week period will see a minimum 10-fold increase in new cases.
There we go. Only 3 months after these exercises, there was a real smallpox outbreak in the United States that would be blamed on Saddam Hussein and Iraq by top government officials, largely swept from history behind the crime of 9/11, especially as the FBI was sabotaging investigation into the real anthrax attacks, and the CIA and US military would refuse to cooperate with the investigation. This same lab would a decade later be officially labelled as the source of the anthrax spores responsible for the 2001 anthrax attacks. Attacks which are also officially said to have been the work of a deranged USAM RIID researcher, despite initially having been blamed on Saddam Hussein and Iraq by top government officials and mainstream media. Those attacks killed 5 Americans and sickened 17. Yet, as the investigation into the 2001 anthrax attacks unfolded, accusations from major US newspapers soon emerged that the FBI was deliberately sabotaging the probe to protect the anthrax attacker, and that the CIA and US military intelligence had refused to cooperate with the investigation. The FBI did not officially close their investigation into the 2001 anthrax attacks, nicknamed Amerithrax, until 2010, and aspects of that investigation still remain classified. The October 5th, 2001 anthrax attacks manufactured consent for the Iraq War. Largely forgotten by corrupt media, the anthrax attacks in the United States happened on the 5th of October 2001, less than a month after 9/11. Letters sent through the US postal system were targeted at US media, with the resulting deaths of 5 workers, 2 US postal workers, a Florida photojournalist, a New York City hospital worker, and a 95-year-old widow in Connecticut, whilst 22 were hospitalized. Judith Miller was part of Operation Dark Winter and would play an influential role in the anthrax attacks themselves, releasing a book called Germs, Scaremongering for Bioterrorism from groups like Al-Qaeda and Iraq. That same morning, stores around the country unveiled a new book called Germs. Co-authored by New York Times reporter Judith Miller, Germs chronicles the history of biowarfare and also proposes that one of the greatest threats that we face is bioterrorism from groups like Al-Qaeda, working with countries like Iraq or even Russia. Miller received special access to senior Bush officials for her book, specifically Scooter Libby, who she portrayed as a heroic genius and a misunderstood soothsayer. And that's from Robbie and Abby Martin's very good article on the 2001 anthrax attacks. And now we move on to Atlantic Storm. Atlantic Storm was a 2005 John Hopkins University pandemic exercise. Atlantic storm, an apocalyptic bioterror outbreak in Europe to increase sales to Big Pharma. Similar to Dark Winter, Atlantic Storm saw policy heads and deep state manipulators confronting a bioterror attack with realistic news reports, also hosted at John Hopkins University. The pandemic exercise featured Madeleine Albright, the ghoul who had declared that 500,000 dead Iraqi children was worth it when asked about American sanctions on Iraq. And this is Atlantic
In real life,
Storm.
they're all former senior policymakers. They don't know what's going to happen today. All they've been told so far of the plot is that there are reports of possible smallpox cases in Europe. Rather than rush home, the heads are using this meeting to work out how they're going to respond to what appears to be a series of bioterrorist attacks.
CNN has now confirmed an outbreak of smallpox in several European countries. Smallpox is the most dreaded disease in history. It is painful, kills 1/3 of its victims, leaves some survivors blind, and most disfigured. For more on this disease, we have Dr. D.A. Henderson, the scientist responsible for the successful campaign to rid the world of smallpox in the 1970s. Dr. Henderson, how should authorities respond to this crisis?
First, they will need to find those who are infected as quickly as possible.
I'm sorry, Dr. Henderson, I'm sorry. GNN has just learned that Al Jazeera has broadcast a tape from a group calling themselves the Al-Jihad Al-Jadid, or the New Jihad, that is claiming responsibility for this smallpox attack.
This crisis has very great collective implications, and what is also clear is that there is a danger in moving too slowly and a danger in moving too fast.
It's a bit different from what we have seen from Al-Qaeda in the past, where some actions were mostly directed against the West, and here they are obviously running the risk of enormous collateral damage. I mean, you can hardly call it collateral damage in Islamic countries, because smallpox is not, doesn't stop at the borders of religion and race.
As far as the tone of our response is concerned, I have already instructed my ministers that they should not use any language which would inflame racial or ethnic tension. I believe that we should do the same.
I can tell you also, I don't know whether you're getting this from your people, but our population is getting somewhat agitated.
This is the emergency period, and we must not lose 1 hour. And we must decide all together, because we must be in agreement to offer the same attitude in our countries.
I do want to open this up for floor discussion, but first I'd like to have a briefing from the summit staff.
I'm the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, and I'm speaking on behalf of the collective summit staff. As of 9 a.m., there are 51 reported cases of smallpox reported to national governments and then to the summit staff. In Germany, there are 25 suspected cases, concentrated mostly in or around Frankfurt and Munich. In the Netherlands, 8 suspected cases in or around Rotterdam. In Turkey, 15 cases in or around Istanbul. And in Sweden, there are 3 suspected cases in Stockholm. This pattern strongly suggests that multiple bioterrorist attacks have occurred, probably in Frankfurt, Rotterdam, Istanbul, and Stockholm. It will be a week before all the victims of these attacks have begun to show signs of smallpox. And we believe it should be assumed that each of these cases will in turn infect 3 others, and by mid-February, we will be seeing an epidemic of 10,000 cases of smallpox.
We in the UK have already taken some precautionary measures. Our medical staffs have been vaccinated, and I've instructed that all workers at our ports and airports should also be vaccinated. We are issuing a travel advisory which bans travel to the areas directly concerned, both to and from it.
My country is ready to give help to the rest of the world and to start giving vaccine through WHO and eventually to restart the fabrication of new vaccine doses.
My experience over the last years is that the discussions at the general level about solidarity, about how to deal with the potential needs in a bioterrorist or in a reoccurrence by accident of smallpox is easier to discuss at the general level than when you get into a situation where you have to make clear commitments.
Before they share vaccine, they need to know how much they've got to begin with. It turns out that some have a lot more than others.
The important point is that in all, the total global inventory of smallpox vaccine is just over 700 million doses, enough to vaccinate a little more than 10% of the world's population.
The US, Germany, France, and the Netherlands have enough to vaccinate all their citizens, but they don't have much left over for anybody else. Canada, Sweden, and Turkey have nothing like enough.
The Republic of Turkey has formally requested that the North Atlantic Council immediately invoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, and under Article 5, Turkey is requesting immediate assistance from its NATO allies. Turkey has minimal stocks of vaccine, and this request would cover its entire population of 70 million.
Turkey needs our solidarity, no question about that.
Criminal imperialist organisations and their connections. Other participants include Luciana Borio, a biodefence expert and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, later joined Biden's COVID-19 task force, highlighting her influence in pandemic preparedness. Gro Harlem Brundtland, a former WHO Director General and Norwegian Prime Minister, has expressed concerns about too much freedom of speech, aligning with narratives of centralised control during crises. Jan Eliasson, a Swedish diplomat, and Gigi Quick Gronvall, another CFR member involved in pandemic scenarios like the SPARS exercise, further underscore the intersection of global health and geopolitical strategy. Bernard Kouchner, a French politician and founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, has brought his experience as a 3-time health minister to the table, while Barbara McDougall, a Canadian CFR advisor and Bilderberg attendee, added a North American perspective. Tara O'Toole, a bioweapons expert whose methods have been described as extreme, and Stefano Silvestri, a Bilderberg steering committee member with deep state ties, round out the group. Klaas de Vries, a retired Dutch politician and Bilderberg attendee, completes this network of individuals whose roles in pandemic planning and global governance have led some to question the influence over the COVID-19 response and its broader implications. For those unaware, Bilderberg Group is a highly secretive organisation bringing together the top capitalists of the world. Council on Foreign Relations is a holdover from the British Empire to subjugate the entire world, and today works to bind Washington to London. Council on Foreign Relations is also a long-standing imperialist milieu. CFR played a pivotal role in orchestrating the cover-up of the JFK assassination. CFR elites, including Alan Dulles, Nelson Rockefeller, George H.W. Bush, George Bundy, were not only involved but actively sponsored the covert coup. Gorton further reveals that CFR members like Alan Dulles, John McCloy and Gerald Ford took centre stage in the Warren Commission's efforts to obscure the truth. What's even more striking is the CFR's deep infiltration of the media landscape. An astonishing number of influential publishers, editors and journalists were CFR members, effectively controlling the narrative. Among them were media titans like Henry Luce of Time and Life, Arthur Ochs Schulzberger of the New York Times, and William Paley and CBS, alongside iconic figures such as Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, Pete Jennings and James Reston. Even later power players like Rupert Murdoch, Michael Eisner, Bill Clinton and George Stephanopoulos maintained ties to the CFR, underscoring its enduring influence over both media and politics. This web of connections reveals a disturbing level of coordination in shaping public perception and burying the truth. The CFR's roles in previous crimes should give a track record of their behaviour as a deeply anti-democratic group of people who work more like a mob or mafioso. A writer who studied the CFR concluded it was Wall Street's think tank, and explained the networking effect of the CFR in uniting America's capitalist class. The Council on Foreign Relations is the ultimate networking and socializing institution of the US capitalist ruling class. But it does not operate in isolation, rather it is at the center of an extensive network of key institutions in a number of interconnected realms of US social life, politics, think tanks, finance and economics, higher education, philanthropy, media and culture. The US capitalist class has a core and a periphery. The CFR and its members are at the core of the dominant sector of this class, but the network extends broadly. The nearly 5,000 individuals who are members and leaders of the council collectively have hundreds of thousands of ties, social, economic and political relationships that bind them into a community of the powerful. This is one reason why so many people want to join and participate in the council and its activities. Those at the core of the large clique that makes up the CFR's inner circle have common traits, access to the same general information and mostly homogeneous opinions. They have close and frequent interactions, a daisy chain of connections to various organisations, resulting in strong ties and relationships with one another, and powerful positions in their groups, the political economy and the larger society. That's from Lawrence Shoup's Wall Street think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Empire of Neoliberal Geopolitics. As we shall see, these same operators and lackeys of monopoly capital in these same organisations would eventually be responsible for the COVID-19 event, but not before they had rehearsed it until perfection. Atlantic Storm, an exercise in big pharma advertisement. Atlantic Storm was ultimately about corralling the Europeans into paying and stockpiling vaccines. In the conclusion document, the programme insists, quote, nations must begin working together now to prepare systems that will support a collaborative international response to destabilizing epidemics, whether of natural cause or the result of bioterrorism. National leaders will be able to create such systems in the midst of a crisis. Furthermore, diplomatic and political preparation, while critical, will not matter if appropriate medicines, vaccines, and medical and public health capacity are lacking. So systems must be comprehensive in scope, and that's from John Hopkins themselves. And you know how they say will not matter if appropriate medicines and vaccines and medical and public health capacity? Well, during the COVID-19 event, they stopped all alternative forms of medicine, like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and what have you. Atlantic Storm paved the way for European nations to shell out billions on swine flu vaccines. Deep state propagandists like Neil Ferguson, who appeared again in COVID-19 with his ridiculous computer models he had previously gotten wrong for BSE and bird flu, provided the scientific backing for both the swine flu pandemic and the later COVID event. In 2009, Ferguson and his imperial team predicted that swine flu had a case fatality rate of 0.3% to 1.5%. His most likely estimate was that the mortality rate was 0.4%. A government estimate based on Ferguson's advice said a reasonable worst-case scenario was that the disease would lead to 65,000 UK deaths. In the end, swine flu killed 457 people in the UK and had a death rate of just 0.026% in those infected. Why did the imperial team overstate the fatality of the disease? Or to borrow Robinson's words to Hancock this morning, that prediction wasn't just nonsense, was it? It was dangerous nonsense. And that's from a Spectator article. Atlantic Storm and Anne Applebaum, the anti-communist and anti-Russian crusader driving the world to a third world war. Anne Applebaum, a deep state neocon, also took part in Atlantic Storm and is worth zooming on briefly only to get a gist and caliber of the people swimming in these corrupt, criminal and democidal imperialist organizations that shut down the entire world and force vaccinated billions of people. That's a picture of Van Applebaum there, the criminal. Applebaum is primarily an anti-communist and anti-Russian activist. The Integrity Initiative leak exposed her and a number of journalists and academics as deep state actors to be given favour. Applebaum has attended Bilderberg meetings 2015, 2016, 2018, 2022, 2023 and 2024. Her history books mostly revolve around trying to equate the Soviets, who liberated Nazi camps, with the Nazis. In doing so, she has resurrected Nazi propaganda in the form of the so-called Holodomor with her book Red Famine. To get an example of the filth poured out of this prostitute of the imperialist bourgeoisie, Mark Tauger, again, who's an American historian, so a lot of these historians debunking the bullshit anti-communists are liberal American historians, did a scathing review of her book by picking through her footnotes to show the world the liar she is. From the below two paragraphs, we get the gist of this deep state prostitute working for empire and why she lies, for both anti-communist ideology and to revive Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, they revive Ukrainian nationalism. Well, they've been trying to do that since the end of World War II. Like MI6 and CIA were financing the Banderites after World War II, promising them a new world war in which they would get their ethnically pure Ukrainian state. A book came out in 2018, so provided a boost to the Ukrainian fascists who decided it would be a worthwhile endeavour to throw themselves at the Muscovites and start a war with Russia. You know, there's video clips of like post-2014 when they couped the government in Ukraine in 2014. They were teaching in schools to kill all the Muscovites, and they said, and they'd have big videos of huge loads of children saying, anyone not jumping is a Muscovite. Yes, you get an idea of the retarded propaganda that was being aimed at the Ukrainian population. I mean, they did the same thing to the Ukrainians that they did to the Afghans. In Afghanistan, Washington Post had a great article called The ABC of Jihad. And basically all the jihadist propaganda and education materials in the schools at the time was created and airdropped by the Americans during the Soviet-Afghan War. And they were still teaching that when the Americans invaded Afghanistan under George Bush. And I suppose my point is that the same people that are starting these wars all over the globe are the same people responsible for pandemic preparedness exercises in which they get to inject you with a lethal cocktail, as was done under the cover of the COVID-19 event. Perhaps even more important, Applebaum completely ignores the fact that these starving peasants were the ones who ended the famine with the help of Soviet famine relief by producing a much larger harvest in 1933. She mentions peasant work in early 1933 extremely elliptically, and never mentions the many agencies the regime established to help farmers overcome the famine. Applebaum's second summary conclusion concerned Ukrainian nationalism. She argues that the famine was a political famine created for the express purpose of weakening peasant resistance and thus national identity, and in this it succeeded. Yet she provides only anecdotal evidence of peasant resistance and never explains how it was related to national identity. Her main evidence for this consists of stories fabricated by officials about peasant conspiracies and connections with Ukrainian nationalists abroad. If resistance meant peasants holding back produce for higher prices, it is difficult to see this as nationalist, because it caused people in Ukrainian cities to starve, and because Russian peasants were accused of this as well. Later, in discussing Nazi genocide in Ukraine, she makes an even stronger claim. This was Stalin's policy, multiplied many times, the elimination of whole nations through starvation. But 24 pages later, she writes, Stalin did not seek to kill all Ukrainians. She never addresses this contradiction and never documents either claim. Now, you need to go and read the full article by Mark Tauger. I'll zoom in a bit there so you can see it. It's a huge article, though. But he basically goes through every single footnote. You see the footnotes he's got there. He's got their footnotes. He goes through every single footnote, and in doing so, just shows how Anne Applebaum is either lying about the footnote, twisting something about in the footnote, or just completely making something up about that footnote. The reason for anti-communist and anti-Russian lies were to regroup Ukrainian nationalism under the fascist organization of Ukrainian nationalists and Stepan Bandera. Hitlerite collaborators to be sharpened as a spear into the belly of Russia. Douglas Tottle in 1987 had already written Fraud, Famine and Fascism, showing how the Holocaust collaborators under the OUN and Banderite followers in Ukraine were trying to rewrite history to defend their Nazi collaboration and the mass murder they committed. In the 1930s, this propaganda came out in American courts that the famine genocide was the product of the Yellow Hearst press, himself a Nazi sympathizer. And that's William Randolph Hearst there. Oh, that's William Randolph Hearst there. And in the 1930s, he was known as America's #1 fascist, and he's opposing with the leaders of Nazi Germany in his 1934 visit there. He's with so left to right is Mr. Rocker, Hearst private secretary, Alfred Rosenberg, William Randolph Hearst, so he's in the middle, Dr. Karl Boehmer, press division chief of the Nazi Foreign Political Bureau, and Thilo van Rofer, Rosenberg's lieutenant. And then a few months after his return to the US, he launched his famine propaganda campaign. And an interesting intersection here is that William Randolph Hearst also paid Trotsky over $1 million in today's money, if you adjusted the money for inflation, for a series of articles in the Hearst press. So you got to wonder why America's #1 fascist is financing Leon Trotsky. Well, we all know why, because Trotsky was a fucking rat. Resurrected decades later by cold warriors, the revising of history of the Ukrainian Holocaust collaborators went mainstream with Robert Conquest. Jeff Copeland, writing in The Village Voice, expands as to how this propaganda has been used post-World War II, ultimately with the aim of revising fascism in Ukraine, so Ukrainians can be hurled at Russia to balkanize and destroy that nation, one of the last nations holding out against a fascist technocracy where human beings are no more than hackable animals. Here is how the story is a fraud. The starving girl, it turns out, was found in 1932 or 1933, not in the Ukraine. Her picture was taken from a Red Cross bulletin on the 1921-22 Volga famine, which no one claims genocide. Rather than an emblem of persecution, the photograph advances the most cynical of swindles. A hoax played out from the White House and Congress through the halls of Harvard to the New York State Department of Education. Pressing every pedal, pulling on all the strings, is a Ukrainian nationalist lobby straining to cloak its own history of Nazi collaboration. By revising their past, these emigres help support a more ambitious revisionism, a denial of Hitler's Holocaust against the Jews. Just as the Nazis used the OUN for their own ends, so has Reagan exploited the famine from his purple-prosed commemoration of this callous act to his backing of the Mace Commission. Faced with failing fascist allies around the world, from Nicaragua to South Africa, the US war lobby needs to boost anti-communism as never before. Public enthusiasm to fight for the Contras will not come easy, but if people could be convinced that communism is worse than fascism, that Stalin was an insane monster, even worse than Hitler, that the 7 million died in more unspeakable agony than the 6 million, where we might just be up for the next Gulf of Tonkin, one cannot appease an evil empire, after all. That's from The Village Voice in search of a Soviet Holocaust. Stalin's name has pretty much been cleared, to be honest. You've even got like, I don't know, I think he's a Gen Xer academic agent on YouTube, and he's done a video about how everything you've been told about Stalin is a lie, and he's like a hard right conservative. So I mean, all of the lies against Stalin have come undone in the last 10 years or so. I say anyone is still like boogeymen for boomers and Gen X retards, but what can you do? This may seem divergent to the general theme of this article. However, the main objectives of Operation Aerodynamic, and that was an operation by American intelligence, basically to scoop up Ukrainian fascists and try and regroup them in London, Toronto, and America to sort of keep the nationalist emigre community alive so that they could be redeployed back into Ukraine at any time to kind of start a war. It's what America does all the time. It's why the Chinese called them the headquarters of the reactionaries worldwide. The main objectives of Operation Aerodynamic and the rehabilitation of Ukrainian fascism have been achieved. A giant war with Russia that could just as easily turn into a full-out war or nuclear war. There's the book. I definitely recommend you read it. Liberal totalitarians falsify communist history non-stop. When J. Arch Getty, an honest American historian, began researching Soviet history, he stated unequivocally the propaganda people are subjected to in imperialist society, and how Soviet historiography allowed sources that would not hold up in any other area of academia. A weak tradition of source criticism and a developing historiography on related problems both suggest the need to re-evaluate the 30s. In their writings on the Great Purges, scholars and journalists have traditionally relied rather heavily on the memoirs of emigres and defectors from the Soviet Union, as well as on the personal accounts of victims of terror. Yet historians have been justifiably sceptical of memoirs and autobiographies. Louis Gottschalk, the famous historian of the French Revolution, believed them to be untrustworthy sources written later in life for a mass audience by people whose intentions were dubious. Paul Fussell, in his celebrated study of World War I memoirs, has observed that the memoir is a kind of fiction differing from the first novel only by continuous implicit attestations of veracity or appeals to documented historical fact. The further personal written materials move from the form of the daily diary, the closer they approach to the figurative and the fictional. Yet reliance on this class of evidence has been pervasive and of long standing. The inaccessibility of archival sources on the Great Purges has led to a willing suspension of disbelief and to something less than rigorous methodology. For no other period or topic have historians been so eager to write and accept history by anecdote. Grand analytical generalizations have come from second-hand bits of overheard corridor gossip, prison camp stories. My friend met Bukharin's wife in a camp and she said, unquote, have become primary sources on central political decision-making. The need to generalize from isolated and unverified particulars has transformed rumours into sources and has equated repetition of stories with confirmation. Indeed, the leading expert on the Great Purges has written that truth can thus only percolate in the form of hearsay, and that basically the best, though not infallible, source is rumour. That's an actual quote from Robert Conquest, that the best quote is basically rumours. As long as the unexplored classes of sources include archival and press material, it is neither safe nor necessary to rely on rumour and anecdote. That's from J.H. Getty, Origins of the Great Purges. And David M. Glantz, also American and largely considered the best historian on the Eastern Front, stated in When the Titans Clashed that we in the West had learned a German perspective on the war, and that important battles had been concealed from a Western public for political reasons. When the first edition of this book was published in 1995, the authors gratefully benefited from the modest first wave of archival materials released by the Russian Federation, which increased our knowledge of the war twofold and enabled us to add substantial Russian context and detail to what had previously been a largely German perspective on the war. Thanks to those initial releases, the book's first edition restored a modicum of truth and accuracy to the Soviet side of the war by identifying battles forgotten or concealed for political reasons, and by adding more candid detail to the description of battles already well known. Likewise, a clearer understanding of what the Red Army actually achieved tempered the obvious German bias so evident in the historiography on the war during the Cold War years. However, despite this beneficial releases, yawning gaps still existed in the historical record of the war in 1995, the most vexing of which was the paucity of accurate numbers quantifying the scope and ferocity of the struggle. Now most of those gaps have been filled and the missing numbers are becoming readily available. That's from David M. Glantz's When Titans Clashed. You might ask why a Western public was getting Germany's version of events for World War II, the loser of World War II the West had fought against. The answer is already in these pages. Liberal totalitarian liars that are paid handsomely to spread anti-communist nonsense. So we now come to 2010, which is the Operation Lockstep. Rockefeller Foundation's Operation Lockstep. In 2010, the Rockefeller Foundation issued Operation Lockstep. The Rockefeller Foundation has previously been described by a US Supreme Justice as, there develops within the state a state so powerful that the ordinary social and industrial forces existing are insufficient to cope with it. And that was Supreme Justice Louis Brandeis in 1915. So that's over 100 years ago, these people had complete control of the American state. And that's in the book, René A. Wormser, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. But to implement the Rockefeller Foundation Operation Lockstep, written in 2010, quote, however, a few countries did fare better, China in particular. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens, as well as its instant and near hermetic sealing off of all borders, saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of the virus far earlier than in other countries and enabling a swifter post-pandemic recovery. Written in 2010. You know, Contagion came out about that time as well. I think it might have been 2009 or 2011. We have a quick look. So this is Operation Lockstep that I'm reading. Yeah, a lockstep. A world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. So you see their timeline started a bit earlier here, with 2013 being when the first person is quarantined, and then trade hit by strict pathogen controls in 2015, and then Africa embracing authoritarian capitalism, a la China. But in this, you can see how the Chinese and the Chinese revisionists worked in part with the imperialists, because the Chinese revisionists put together zero COVID and then they pushed that on all the communist parties worldwide. Yeah, this document is definitely worth a read. CladeX, a 2018 pandemic simulation for population reduction. The CladeX pandemic simulation, orchestrated by the John Hopkins Center for Health Security, was designed to jolt security and policy leaders into confronting the grim realities of a global health crisis. Its stated mission was to raise awareness and push participants to envision the catastrophic possibilities of a pandemic, emphasizing the need for collaboration across public health, politics, law, diplomacy, defense, homeland security, and intelligence sectors. The exercise aimed to simulate not only the devastating consequences of a pandemic, but also the emerging threats posed by synthetic biology, which could be used to engineer dangerous pathogens, either accidentally or intentionally, sparking a global catastrophe. One of the first events after the outbreak, according to the script, was the development of a PCR test to detect the virus. I've examined PCR tests previously. For the COVID-19 event, they were giving a 97% false positive. Kary Mullis had pointed this out for decades, as he was the one that invented the PCR test, and it was never meant to be used as a diagnostic. During the AIDS pandemic, PCR tests ruined people's lives, and children were taken away from their parents to be murdered with the cell-destroying drug AZT. See the BBC documentary Guinea Pig Kids that was shortly pulled off the air by Big Pharma. This is a quote from my Scottish COVID inquiry, exposes a new era of scientific medical tyranny. PCR tests were never properly validated, and PCR tests in general, as a test that magnifies by many orders of magnitude, very weak signals, can be extremely prone to false positives if not used correctly. This exact fact is pointed out by the inventor of PCR, Kary Mullis, who died in 2019, just before the COVID outbreak. How did they misuse PCR to estimate all the supposed free viral RNAs that may or not be there? In fact, bollocks, I'll just show the video. PCR works via cycles of amplification. During the pandemic, tests were set at 40 cycles. The fraud of doing this is spelled out plainly below. It can be observed that at CT, this is the number of cycles that a PCR test is ran through, up to 70% of patients remain positive in culture, and that at CT, so cycles 30, this value drops to 20%. At CT5, as in 35 cycles for a PCR test, the value we use to report positive result for PCR, less than 3% of culture are negative. In other words, at cycles of CT35 produce a false positive rate of 97%. This false positive rate explains why coronavirus tests used in Tanzania were dismissed as faulty by President John Magufuli on Sunday, because he said they had returned positive results on samples taken from a goat and a pawpaw. Confirmation of the PCR test's oversensitivity was strongly implied by the release of CDC guidelines for collecting infectious samples in 2021, stating positive result within 28 cycles was required for valid samples, indicating samples showing positive at an amplification of 40 cycles were not valid. For cases with a known RT-PCR cycle threshold value, submit only specimens with CT value less than 28 to CDC for sequencing. Sequencing is not feasible with higher CT values. So even the Center for Disease Control says anything higher than 28 is not valid for testing. And they were doing these PCR tests at 35 and even as high as 40. CladeX, a genetically engineered virus for overpopulation. And I'll flick through some of this just so you get a flavour of what it's like.
Think about the challenges that look at the big picture of this committee, called the Executive Committee, or EXCOM for short, are members of the National Security Council, and then a few additional members that the President thought were necessary, including the Senate Majority Leader and the co-chair of the Congressional Biodefense Caucus. Now, you will see during the course of the day that a lot of information is conveyed to this group over video news clips, and we understand that that's not how the NSC gets its attention. And Tom Inglesby.
We are continuing our coverage of a new and deadly infectious disease that broke out in Frankfurt, Germany and Caracas, Venezuela. 2 days ago, the World Health Organization responded by declaring a public health emergency of international concern, a highly unusual step and an indication of its deep worry. Here are the numbers. In Frankfurt and Caracas, the illness has killed an estimated 50 people. There are 400 confirmed or probable cases, with additional reports of suspected but unconfirmed cases. The illness first appeared in Frankfurt about 4 weeks ago. The patients were initially diagnosed with viral encephalitis, a kind of brain infection. Some also were suffering from pneumonia. The first death occurred within days. In Germany, there have been several clusters of cases within families and at workplaces. At least 4 of the dead were healthcare workers who had treated patients infected with the disease. Based on this, German authorities have concluded that the illness is likely spread to person, probably through inhalation of the virus. Our medical reporter Emily Schmidt is at the CDC in Atlanta with more. Emily, what can you tell us?
Gene, CDC officials tell us that most cases are occurring in healthy adults, but there are some cases in children and the elderly. 3 U.S. Air Force service members at Ramstein Air Base have been diagnosed with the disease. Multiple hospitals are involved in Germany, including the U.S. Army's Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. Patients are being placed in respiratory isolation. Many worried well are showing up in emergency departments and clinics. Public health authorities in Germany have been working to isolate the sick and track those who have been exposed. Now, this disease is characterized by fever, cough, confusion, and in many cases, coma, respiratory failure, and death. Initial tests to identify what was causing the outbreak were all negative, but scientists at the Robert Koch Institute discovered a previously unknown virus in the spinal fluid of several of the patients, a new type of para-influenza virus. Para-influenza is a common respiratory virus. It's unrelated to influenza and typically causes colds in adults and croup in kids. It does not normally cause severe illness in otherwise healthy adults.
Thanks, Emily. Venezuela is reacting very differently. Authorities there are denying there is an outbreak, despite reliable reports from people in Caracas of hospitals being swamped by hundreds of suspected encephalitis cases. There are no details or accurate numbers for us to report. However, Colombian health officials have confirmed that 3 people who fled to Bogota from Caracas for medical care do have the virus. How's the
Director for Global Health, Security, and Biothreats from the NSC to brief us on what the U.S. government is doing to start.
Good morning, everybody. Here's the timeline of these tests. The first cases of the outbreak seem to have appeared in Frankfurt approximately 4 weeks ago, and in Caracas approximately 2 weeks ago. We can confirm that there are 3 U.S. service members. There are more than 100 cases and 20 deaths. Surveillance is poor in many countries, so we can't be sure that
Like the initial cases of SARS and MERS virus, the origin of clade X is uncertain. We know that most newly discovered human viruses, what we call emerging infectious diseases, result from animal viruses that jump the species barriers from animals to people. So that would be our initial hypothesis. Germany has shared a sample of the virus with the US, and so NIH and
See that jump from animals to people?
CDC, in collaboration with top US para-influenza scientists, are analyzing it. There are no known antiviral drugs that seem likely to be helpful for the disease, although thousands of licensed drugs are being screened. There have been human para-influenza virus vaccines in development for years, but none are licensed. And our initial assessment is that none that are in development are likely to be effective against this strain of the virus, given its genetic distinctions. But we will be examining that. Vaccine research has been initiated by US government and pharma labs in a number of other countries, including China, India, Brazil, and the EU. The best estimate by leading vaccine producers is that it could take a year or more to develop, test, and manufacture a vaccine for the clade X virus.
Thank you, Dr. Dalja. Just to reiterate, this is not influenza, but the CDC does judge this to have pandemic potential because it is a novel virus and it does seem to exhibit
to CDC, which is 1 year to produce a vaccine for this, is too long. And I think the President ought to make clear whatever it takes to shorten that period of time, we need to do.
All right. Any comments?
Why don't I build on that? Let me first say what we've already done. As in past cases, we have set up a task force inside the State Department. We did that when the Ebola
patients emerge, and we do have a network for routine care and emergency care, but we need to be working closely with that system. We need to really be canvassing to make sure that we know where the
We're going to work in a collaborative way to address those unknowns as quickly as we can. We should have stockpiled, we didn't, but we're going to have to look at
Back to the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf, where the president was viewed as observing a problem about to hit our shores without an action plan. So I would very quickly, if we could, Tom, come up with an agenda of action items, and that includes, in particular, addressing the resources and capabilities and inclinations in the states. Because, they have within the states any number of powers that we have only with some level of complexity, including with respect to the National Guard. I think Secretary O'Toole's idea about full engagement with the private sector and the research community is very good, but I would come up with an action agenda. This is not a legal question. This is a public policy observation from somebody who's been around for a long time.
And let's be careful not to overpromise. I mean, already the discussion about vaccines is making me a little bit nervous because there have been vaccines in development for many years. It doesn't look like any of those are going to be effective against this. So let's not get the American people thinking that if we just put more money and rolled up our sleeves, we could get them a vaccine tomorrow.
Do you think 12 months is overpromising?
I think we should be very careful. I think we should say it's a high priority. For sure.
So you see the kind of thing that it is. And all the parasites are here, like representatives of big pharma, government officials, that kind of thing. The scenario began with simultaneous outbreaks of a novel para-influenza virus dubbed clade X in Germany and Venezuela. Initially thought to spread through respiratory droplets, the virus was later revealed to be a genetically engineered hybrid of Nipah and para-influenza, raising questions about its origins, natural or man-made. The virus spread rapidly, doubling cases every 2 weeks, overwhelming healthcare systems worldwide, with routine antivirals proving ineffective and a vaccine more than a year away. The simulation painted a dire picture. By its conclusion, 900 people had perished. The simulated newscast introducing the virus states Australia, China and South Africa are restricting travel from Venezuela. Scientists have given this flu a new name, para-influenza clade X, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the days, weeks and possibly months to come. Whilst Amesh Adalja, a CDC stooge, tells vaccine research has been initiated by US government and pharma labs and a number of countries. China, Brazil, India and the EU. The best estimate for leading vaccine producers is it could take a year or more to develop, test and manufacture a vaccine for the clade X virus. Adding a layer of intrigue, the exercise introduced a fictional terrorist group, a brighter dawn, which released the virus to achieve a global reset or paradigm shift to address overpopulation. This narrative foreshadowed themes that would later echo in the COVID-19 pandemic, including the rush for untested treatments and vaccines. The summary highlighted the urgent need for rapid medical countermeasure development, pointing to advances in synthetic biology and novel vaccine technologies like self-amplifying mRNA and recombinant vaccines. These innovations, the exercise argued, could revolutionize the ability to produce vaccines and drugs for novel pathogens within months, not years. A Johns Hopkins document describes a decadent bourgeois group, a brighter dawn, that have so little to worry about in their actual lives they become prominent mass murderers for the Malthusian overpopulation and the green agenda. A brighter dawn, international group focused on overpopulation. No, this is a literal slide from the Cladex simulation. No past history of violence, well-funded, local chapters in several countries. FBI has identified multiple US members. One is a para-influenza researcher whose whereabouts are unknown. All other known US members have been detained. A brighter dawn, and this is one of the documents from Cladex, and this is about a Brighter Dawn terrorist group. A Brighter Dawn was established in the 1990s in the United States. This group's stated purpose was to slow and eventually reverse the degradation of the planet that was occurring from overpopulation. ABD's goal at the time was to help humanity return to an earlier state of being. The group's activities were uniformly peaceful at the time and included lecture and discussion sessions, grassroots activism, and outreach. By 2010, Brighter Dawn's membership had grown substantially in both numbers and geographic diversity. There were members and local chapters in many countries. At around that time, a split appears to have occurred within a Brighter Dawn. An extreme faction in ABD felt that direct action was needed to achieve the reset or paradigm shift that would be required to fundamentally alter the balance. This splinter group consisted of no more than 30 individuals. A charismatic leader assumed leadership, and he worked closely with about 25 other ABD members in the group who had bioscience training, including virologists. Following the schism, the splinter group established a laboratory near Zurich, Switzerland, and masqueraded as a small biotech startup firm. They set up a sophisticated life science laboratory with commercially available equipment and focused on developing a biological weapon that would have a global impact. ABD's leadership also seems to have been attracted to the concept of a biblical plague as the corrective to humanity's excesses. The splinter group's funding came from members, like-minded private donors, and involvement in illicit activities. Once the cladic pathogen had been successfully developed and manufactured, volunteer ABD members who were willing to risk being infected travelled the globe with small volumes of liquid agent, which they disseminated using commercially available aerosolizers in crowded public places. The public attacks were relatively inefficient in that almost half the attacks failed to infect anyone. In the other attacks, only 50 people on average became clinically ill, but this was sufficient to touch off the Clade X pandemic. Now, reread that last paragraph a couple of times if you check out my article, because that is literally the plot of Utopia, and I'll play a clip of that here now. The well-funded terrorists in Clade X that released the small agent in public crowded places mirrors quite nicely to the BBC TV show Utopia, released in 2013. Except in Utopia, it is eventually revealed that the virus was actually chemical poisoning through the mass-produced processed food system, with the actual aim being to vaccinate the masses with a sterilizing agent. The villains of the story realizing they just needed the fear of a pandemic, not a pandemic itself. The same arguments for so-called overpopulation, resource scarcity, are rehashed by these corrupt bourgeois nihilist criminals. The marriage of the Greens to genocidal ideology is something I've been writing on for a considerable time. I've previously written an article, Fascism Comes in Green as well as Brown, which documents the murderous mentality of many of our tree-hugging Greens, as well as The Scientific Killers Volume 2, Depopulation, Genocide and the Black-Handed Malthus, an energy policy, yes, but for which class, which examines how the bourgeoisie have destroyed our energy grids in the West for Malthusian purposes, producing the utterly bizarre phenomena of the biggest power station in Britain no longer burning coal, but wood pellets from levelling untouched forests in North America. Green energy, indeed. The political conclusions drawn from Cladex were equally striking. The exercise called for strengthened global collaboration under frameworks like the WHO's international health regulations and the global health security agenda. It also emphasized the need for a coordinated international response, a vision that materialized during the COVID-19 pandemic as countries around the world implemented nearly identical measures. Additionally, the exercise warned of potential public resistance to quarantine measures and the spread of misinformation, urging intelligence agencies to develop strategies for managing these challenges. If you ever wanted to know how the entire world was able to march in complete lockstep, it is worth reading the Operation Lockstep document. It is worth reading the Operation Lockstep document by the Rockefeller Foundation. In hindsight, Cladex reads like a prophetic blueprint for the COVID-19 crisis, from the rapid development of mRNA vaccines to the global synchronization of pandemic responses. The exercise not only exposed vulnerabilities in global health systems, but also laid the groundwork for the policies and technologies that would dominate the world's response to the real-life pandemic that followed. And that's a Cladex timeline there. So first illness, April 15, first death, April 18, virus isolated, April 28. If you followed any of my other writings on virology, I don't believe there has ever been a virus that has been isolated. Completely pseudoscience virology. First case in Venezuela is May 1st. Travel ban, May 20. So it's all very similar to kind of what we've seen previously in Atlantic Storm. And September 15th, many domestic hospitals are failing. CDC encouraging telework and social distancing. Schools and public gatherings cancelled. Public demand for surgical masks and respirators. And multiple states deploying the National Guard. And they're considering cancelling in-person voting for the 2018 elections. Right, that'll do it for part 1 of Johns Hopkins University. Are you ready for the next pandemic? A military psychological warfare institution for global control. See you on the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And make sure to follow my Odyssey and my Rumble for the uncensored videos.